This is a capstone project presentation by Gabrielle Vecchio, Master of Education student at Thompson Rivers University. This capstone project, submitted to Thompson Rivers University, is in partial fulfillment of the requirements of the degree of Master of Education. This capstone project is titled Sex Difference in the Classroom, Teaching Sex. Abstract. Sex education is an influential course taught in schools, yet, if taught improperly or inadequately, can create forms of discrimination and bias. In this paper, I argue that with the avoidance of gender binaries and the influence of sexual orientations and gender identities, SOGI 123 strategies, there will be a decrease of oppression that students face within sex education. My awareness in the topic has developed from my training in gender, race, and social justice and my passion for the LGBTQAI2S+ community. Consequently, my critical application can be approached through a human rights and feminist choice. In this paper, I argue that poor treatment, alienation, hierarchies, and the misleading approach to the topic of sex through sex education can all be of unfortunate result. Educators often place roles on their students which pertain to their sex and further pressure them to succumb to these positions. This is seen and highly transparent within our BC sex education experiences and thus significant to address with particular emphasis on SOGI 123 in our province. The application of my narrow focus will look at diverse classrooms, the roles taken by students and educators of the institutional space, and predominantly SOGI 123, concentrating on the education being provided to the youth and their accessibility to all forms of curriculum can inhibit positive modification. BC students should feel accepted and equal to their peers from a gender perspective, and I am arguing that the presentation of an inadequate instruction of sex education can lead to stereotypes and gender binaries in our classrooms. This outlook is challenging, as educative spaces can be subjective and further lead students to foster a deceptive notion in regard to their gender identity and their position within sex education. I will conclude this paper through developing motives for the push for modification in BC sex education curriculum and provide recommendations moving forward towards an inclusive future. Argument. Within our BC curriculum, it is prevalent that there is a lack and disregard for a diverse audience and that binary demonstrations of sex education, gender roles, and topics are a common theme. Educators need to push the implementation of SOGI 123 within BC students' studies in order to promote accessibility to all discourse regarding sex education and to further encourage the inclusion of all bodies with specific emphasis on the LGBTQAI2S+ community. Through improper instruction of sex education and discourse, this can lead to bias, stereotypes, alienation, and gender binaries in BC classrooms. Teaching sex effectively through appropriate conversation and within our abilities of adequate SOGI 123 influence sex education can contribute largely to our students' inclusion within all BC academic teachings. Introduction. To begin Chapter 1, an introduction is provided in order to deliver an understanding of the topic and the argument that will be created and explored within the capstone paper. This chapter will target the repercussions faced with an inadequate sex education, the desire to normalize conversations around sexual identity and gender orientation, and lastly, the implementation of SOGI 123 within BC curriculum. Further to this, Chapter 1 locates my positioning within the material and the experiences of such curriculum throughout my academic endeavors and perception. A recognition is demonstrated on how the paper will proceed and why the desire to focus the attention on this particular subject matter. Moving onward, Chapter 1 will incorporate my developing interest as a student of the Masters of Education program and my growing desire within the topic of equity and the LGBTQAI2S+ community within academia. Sex education is the topic of focus, as courses available within the master's program have sparked interest and been influential in the consciousness of transformational learning experiences and how we can do our part as educators. A focus on the significance of the paper is demonstrated so as to understand the limitations which are presented when inadequate sex education is presented in the BC classrooms and inclusivity is not fostered. Following this, the argument employs that when students are unable to engage with sex education due to the exclusion, biases, prejudices, and stereotypes presented, this can all be harmful to their success and further disregard diversity and the respect of all bodies. Argued is the inclusiveness a child experiences within sex education and how beneficial the engagement of SOGI 123 and appropriate sexual orientation and gender identity discussions are to the students. Moving forward, let's take a look at my devised problem, issue, purpose, claim, and reasons. The organization of the paper and what Chapter 1 will cover. Overall, it will look into the repercussions faced by inadequate sex education in BC, the push for normalized conversation around sexual orientation, and the desire to effectively incorporate sexual orientation and gender identity, SOGI 123 frameworks, within our BC curriculum. I will demonstrate how my experiences have shaped me to be mindful of sex education in BC and to further recognize the need for the influence of SOGI 123. My methods, mechanisms, and manners have all been positively affected due to the various experiences within each course of the Masters of Education program and the impacts from lessons, peers, and most prominently, support from various educators. This chapter will proceed by looking at acceptance and largely how to improve discrimination towards diverse bodies of the BC classroom. Assembling my thoughts pertaining to sex education within the BC curriculum, my experiences have been embedded in the black and white discussion of such curriculum versus addressing the potential barriers towards certain bodies. I developed an interest in the matter when I accepted that there is too broad of a sex education platform within BC. I specifically questioned the range of feelings from the students, educators, and parents, and what their impression was amongst a classroom, with recognition on sexual orientation and acceptance of materials. With the implementation of SOGI 123 work, certain institutions have broken through these constructive norms, but many have yet to recognize its positive impact and are reluctant to encourage its administration. Sex education can exemplify many structures concerning our sexuality and gender, yet I claim that when inadequately taught, and without the mandatory implementation of SOGI 123 in BC, we are providing students with a disservice. The outline of the paper. Chapter 2, Literature Review. Looking at SOGI 123 in BC, teaching in BC, gender ideology and empowerment, BC approach, and the protection of the LGBTQAI2S+ community. Chapter 3, Application. It will look at inclusive sex education, SOGI 123, BC's sex education involvement, human rights, the importance and future of sex education. Chapter 4, Conclusion. References and recommendations moving forward. Chapter 2, Literature Review. Chapter 2 provides validity and a presence of support in terms of the sources incorporated in the connection to the argument of adequate sex education in BC. The literature review highlights a concern for sex education in BC, the ability to provide inclusion within the classroom, the accessibility of curriculum, and the avoidance of discrimination due to gender biases and or binary roles placed. On page 9 of the literature, it is understood that adequate dialogue can be connected to an alleviation of stress in regard to position within sex education curriculum and the feelings encompassing. The literature review encompasses the question of what is SOGI 123, the procedure of teaching sex education in BC, the conversation of gender ideology and empowerment, the need for appropriate sex ed, the BC approach, the protection of the LGBTQAI2S+ community, gender stereotypes, and a summary to conclude. Through these various sections, applicable sources are analyzed and provided in order to reference connections and the reality of the argument from various researchers and authors. Literature is supported through various resources in order to address the need for a broader and inclusive education platform. Examples such as PUC, Parents United Canada, demonstrate the denial that certain groups face, in this case parents, who are reluctant and uncertain about SOGI 123 and sex education. The review of literature presents both aspects of how inadequate sex education is detrimental to students, how we can provide inclusivity within our materials, and further, the hindrance of employing it within the classrooms and what this can result in. Important factors which are reflected is the allowance of gender expression, students' achievement, accessible sexual orientation discussions, and the implementation within the classrooms, allowing all bodies the capability to feel equal. Important literature contributions are Chisholm, Hernandez, Golzaz and Sanchez, Bordallo, Alfonso, Taylor and Peter, Sinclair, Palm and Gilbert, and others. Excellent summary of evidence is provided within the extensive support from the various sources and references in order to advance the argument. Literature review, a look at SOGI 123. SOGI 123 is a set of resources and educational support provided to educators in order to create inclusivity and safety for students of all sexual orientation and gender identities, SOGI, within academic spaces, wherein 1 stands for policies and procedures allocated to reduce discrimination, 2 for creating an inclusive learning environment, and 3 providing academic plans which educate on SOGI topics such as diversity and LGBTQAI2S+ conversations for the educators. The impact of SOGI 123 has been highly visible amongst the BC demographic, and through this has sparked immense conversation in the discourse between who is in favor and who is not. Looking at a quote that resonates. As such, the school's curricula may help to improve school climate and conversations around sexual diversity. Curricula may provide students with an understanding for youth who are different from themselves, and curricula could model positive behavior toward those peers. BAMS, page 2. The study prepared by BAMS resonates and correlates directly with SOGI 123 as it exposes a wider range of topics within sexual education. It looks at the intervention in LGBTQAI2S+ name-calling by all parties within an academic space. The idea of addressing a broader form in terms of inclusive sex education dialogue forms the ability to lessen amounts of discrimination and generate safety within the academic space. Literature review, looking at main reasons of the argument and main pieces of evidence. Main reasons of argument. To understand how effective and adequate sex education in British Columbia classrooms can be. Argued is the freedom to showcase gender identity, engage appropriately in sex education, and be acknowledged within all forms of curriculum. Moving onwards, we will argue the lack of sufficient sex education that is available to students in BC. PUC, Parents United Canada, reckon that SOGI 123 is not necessary for the child's comprehension, and that it is teaching curriculum not applicable to the student's mental, physical, and emotional well-being. The PUC program is designed to stand against all school districts who employ SOGI 123 curriculum within their materials and exercise the message that children should not be taught that there are no differences between males and females. Main pieces of evidence. The reflection that SOGI 123 is effective and how it can be implemented within British Columbia institutes. Not meeting the needs of the LGBTQAI2S plus community within curriculum. The ability to allocate equality and tolerance in sex ed. Evidence of the lack of sufficient sex education and the disregard of gender expression and orientations. Referenced Bazo recognizes the stereotypes pertaining to gender reflected in forms of socialization and hidden curriculum, and this is another means of effective evidence within the capstone paper. Literature review. What is emphasized? Through the inadequate delivery of sex education, forms of bullying, discrimination, biases, and prejudices are likely to be exposed. The foundation of this issue can be discovered by the inability to present adequate curriculum when teaching sex education to a diverse audience within British Columbia. Within the literature review, there is a focus on SOGI 123 and teaching methods of sex education in BC. We are demonstrated with a push for diversity and inclusion within literature and how that can be performed within the curriculum. We also take a look at the apprehension into the structure of sex education in BC and the necessity of providing programs such as SOGI 123 into the classroom for a diverse audience, which is reflected within the literature. Confirmation of the argument can be shown within the literature once again. As referenced from Taylor and Peter, 64% feel at risk due to gender, and 54.9% lack safety due to sexual orientation and gender identity. I first began researching on the topic of SOGI 123, and through this developed an admiration for the program and policy. After doing extensive research and already being such an advocate for the LGBTQAI2S+ community, this was the primary foundation and reason to move forward from the literature towards the application. Through this, I uncovered the inadequacy within sex education in BC and how there is a lack for a diverse audience and disregard to implement greater and more effective changes to all types of students. I've been affected in that I am more inclined to pursue such changes that are forefronted within SOGI 123 policies and further adequate, appropriate sex education in BC. Since the Minister of Education announced on 2016 that BC school boards and independent school authorities require SOGI, this is just one step forward to implementing inclusion and changing the delivery of sex education. The application moving forward into Chapter 3 references two significant practical settings that reference the ability to provide adequate sex education material, inclusion, and the ability to access all materials within our BC classrooms. Chapter 3 application will include inclusive sex education, SOGI 123, constructing an inclusive space, our BC sex education involvement, modifying the sex education platform, human rights, the overall importance of sex education, a future for sex education in BC, and lastly, a summary. Within the application, two practical settings which are relevant and consistent with the argument are presented in order to support the overall topic and importance. Both SD 68 and Salima Noon are used, as my claim has significant importance within these two examples. Putting these two within the application provides a strong practical setting which underlines the relevancy in BC's educational outline for sex education. The application as well directly exposes two distinct forms of inclusive curriculum that can be employed to an audience. And this reasons with the entirety of the argument and the employment of effective sex education in BC. Moving forward within the application chapter, we will look at two practical settings, SD68 and Salima Noon. SD68, Nanaimo Ladysmith District, identifies suitable curriculum for what to communicate grade to grade in terms of sex education and health. The written curriculum presents information for how to organize an inclusive space within academics. SD68 provides an approach to the instruction, employing SOGI 123 applications, and the ability to focus on inclusive curriculum in sex education. This is accomplished through teaching how to respond, ways to use effective strategies, and additionally, what each age group requires. SD68 explicitly takes the argument being proposed and uses it effectively, validating the many ways sex education can be taught to an audience from a SOGI 123 framework in BC. Through the commitment to written sex education and age-appropriate direction, educators a part of the district are attempting new forms of delivery in terms of the sex education. Moving onwards to Salima Noon, the second application used within the capstone is her impact within sex education. Noon has developed a successful program within BC institutions which has been recognized amongst numerous spaces and understood for its achievement in students' knowledge towards discussions of gender and sexual identity. Within the novel Talk Sex Today, What Kids Need to Know and How Adults Can Teach Them is an additional source to reflect upon within the application and directly aligns with the argument and the change from inadequate to applicable sex delivery. This is written by Noon and Hickling. The all-encompassing sex education platform written by Noon's constructive demonstration addresses the valuable conceptions regarding gender and the security that comes with the proper education of sexual orientation. Noon showcases a motivation for change and how sex education with regard to inclusivity, celebration of all gender identities and sexual orientations, and further the acceptance of LGBTQAI2S+ community can be reflected within the classroom and effective. Continuing on, a detailed description of the two practices is provided. Overall, what we can note throughout the application chapter is that SD68 teachings and Noon's educational platform can be well represented within the practical setting of the argument and thus supported. Both settings permit comprehensive dialogue in regard to sexual orientation and gender identity. Inclusive materials and teachings offer the ability to create a positive academic climate through modification, and this can be well supported within Bams, Dubas, and Van Aken's article discussing that intervention within institutions which revolve around comprehensive sex education and pressure to create inclusivity further enhance the support for students. More so, it targets human rights as students and showcases a stance for the LGBTQAI2S+ community within inclusive dialogue, teaching, and materials. Linking all chapters. First, let's take a look at links to the argument. Linking argument that inclusive sex education needs to be a focus within BC and the constant mandation of SOGI 123 practices and policies within our BC curriculum. The practical settings provide an authentic recognition and approval within each chapter, and this is seen from chapter 1 onwards. Linking, there is a recognition to various forms of how sex education can be delivered appropriately and the results through this. Looking at the links between chapters, we can see a connection in ways that they showcase aspects of the last, such as sex education, onwards to SOGI 123, moving forward into inclusion, and following the change within BC. There's a link between topics such as gender stereotypes, hidden curriculum, LGBTQAI2S+ community, the inclusivity of sex education in BC, and this all connects in various ways shown within. Lastly, the importance of curriculum and how this can be beneficial to a wide audience and of course within our BC curriculum. Chapter 4, Conclusion. Concluding all chapters, it is very prevalent throughout that all topics provide sustenance, are cumulative, and contribute to the argument in a substantial and supportive way. The main conclusion focuses on how beneficial inclusive materials can be when implemented within our BC institutions and within sex education. Further, it is concluded that the means of modification allows all bodies to enter the conversation of sex education, feel included, have accessibility, and recognize the usage of SOGI 123 within their diverse classroom space. Overall, inclusion and diversity is a common thread seen throughout the capstone and is referred to when sexual orientation and gender identities are celebrated and incorporated within sex education. In Chapter 4, we look at the internal success, the external success of the paper, the short-term recommendations, and the long-term recommendations. Concluding the paper, it is clear that success can be instigated through the means of adjustment and allowance of all bodies within sex education and SOGI 123 resources. Short-term recommendations include permanently making SOGI 123 and adequate sex education a mandatory set of policies and practices for BC educators to utilize and learn and constantly modify. Long-term looks at the limitless acceptance for the LGBTQAI2S+ community in all forms of academics, and for SOGI 123 to constantly modify and alter to better fit the needs of their students. Inclusion, the accessibility for all students, the employment of SOGI 123 teachings, and the capability to foster equity within discussions is the greatest contribution to deliver as educators. Through this, it is established that educators are just one step closer to allocating all members of the classroom the ability to be comfortable and find accessibility within provided materials and teachings exclusively regarding sexual orientation and gender identity. Thank you.